He bought an abandoned farmhouse, thinking it would be a quiet retreat. But when workers broke down a wall in the basement, a terrifying secret was revealed, hidden for almost a century. What they found behind the bricks shocked everyone. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The decision had been months in the making, but when Elijah Carter finally signed his name on the papers, he felt a peculiar sense of gravity settle over him, as though he had just tethered himself to a story far older than his own. He was 29 years old, a young black entrepreneur from Chicago who had built his small tech consultant firm from the ground up. The business was thriving, the city had been good to him, yet somewhere between late nights and glass towers and the constant pulse of trains rattling beneath the streets, Elijah had begun to feel that he was losing something vital. He wanted space, quiet, and a sense of history that the glass and steel of downtown Chicago could never give him. When he saw the listing for an abandoned farmhouse in rural Ohio, something stirred in him, a mixture of curiosity and defiance. The house itself had been standing since the late 19th century, a sprawling two-story structure of weathered clapboard, its roof line sagging slightly, its windows dulled by decades of dust. Photographs showed an overgrown yard, a barn collapsing inward like a broken rib cage, and fields, once meant for corn and wheat, now surrendered to tall weeds and wildflowers. To most prospective buyers, the place was a ruin, a burden of taxes and repairs. To Elijah, it was a challenge, a chance to put down roots in soil where generations had lived and died. The asking price was modest enough that he could afford the gamble, and when the real estate agent hesitantly mentioned that the basement has some oddities, Elijah only smiled. He had learned to read hesitation as opportunity. The drive from Chicago to the property took nearly 7 hours. As the miles unspooled, the skyline dissolved into fields, the roads narrowed, and the air grew sharper with the scent of cut hay and damp earth. Elijah kept imagining the silence that would greet him, the absence of honking horns, the chance to wake to the sound of birds instead of sirens. Yet, when he finally pulled into the long dirt driveway, his optimism was tinged with unease. The farmhouse loomed against a late afternoon sky, its paint peeling in ragged strips, its porch sagging, its windows staring blankly like the sockets of an old skull. It was, he admitted, more desolate than he had expected. The real estate agent, a middle-aged woman with too much perfume and a nervous smile, met him there. She gestured toward the house with a flourish that seemed more dutiful than enthusiastic. "It has good bones," she insisted, and Elijah nodded, though he was not entirely sure he agreed. Inside, the air was stale, a mixture of dust, mildew, and something faintly metallic. Wooden floors groaned under his steps. Wallpaper clung in tatters, but there was space. High ceilings, wide rooms, a grand staircase that still held a certain dignity. He could imagine it restored, filled with light and warmth, even if the present reality was shadowed and cold. When they descended into the basement, Elijah immediately noticed the change in atmosphere. The stone walls were damp, the air heavy, and in one section near the back he saw what the agent had hinted at, a wall of bricks that did not match the rest of the foundation. The stones around it were rough-cut limestone, clearly original, but this patch was made of uniform red bricks, mortared with unusual thickness, as though someone had wanted it to last forever. The agent waved her hand dismissively. "That part's been sealed off for as long as anyone remembers. 30s, maybe earlier. Previous owners never touched it. Probably just structural reinforcement. Anyway, the property is sold as is." Elijah lingered before the bricked wall, his hand brushing the rough surface. It seemed out of place, deliberate in a way that unsettled him, but he said nothing. A secret sealed away for nearly a century might be inconvenient, might even be expensive, but it also whispered of stories waiting to be told. By the time he closed the deal and returned with a rented moving truck weeks later, autumn had spread across the countryside. The fields around the farmhouse glowed with russet and gold, the trees dropping their leaves like faded memories. He carried his boxes into the echoing rooms, listening to the way his footsteps bounced from wall to wall. The silence was heavier than he had imagined, not peaceful but watchful, as though the house were measuring him, deciding whether to accept or reject him. That first night, Elijah lay awake in the upstairs bedroom. The wind slid through cracks in the old window frames, carrying with it the smell of damp leaves. From below came the faint groan of timbers settling, the creak of a stair no one had touched. At 2 a.m, he sat up, convinced he had heard something more, a muffled thump deep beneath the floorboards. He told himself it was nothing, just the house breathing after decades of neglect. Yet, when he closed his eyes, the image of that bricked wall filled his mind. In the days that followed, Elijah explored the property. The barn leaned precariously, but still housed rusting farm tools and a wagon wheel half buried in dirt. Behind the house stretched acres of overgrowth, but he could see the outlines of what had once been orderly fields. He hired a local handyman to help clear the worst of it, and the man, a grizzled fellow with a face like weathered bark, spat tobacco juice into the weeds and muttered, "Strange place to buy. Folks round here don't touch it." When Elijah asked why, the man only shrugged and said, "Some houses keep their dead closer than others." The comment lingered in Elijah's thoughts longer than he cared to admit. He had not told anyone about the odd wall in the basement, not even his closest friends back in Chicago. It felt like a private dare, a mystery that belonged to him alone. Each night he found himself drifting toward the basement door, his hand resting on the handle, listening. Once he thought he caught the faintest echo, like air moving in a sealed space, or perhaps something softer, a sound at the edge of perception. He forced himself back upstairs, telling himself it was only his imagination. On the 4th evening, while unpacking boxes on the 2nd floor, Elijah discovered an old trunk shoved into the corner of a closet. The wood was cracked, the lock broken. Inside lay a scatter of yellowed papers and a small bundle of sepia photographs tied with twine. The images were faded, but he could make out the outlines of the farmhouse, fresher, prouder, with people posed stiffly in front. One showed a man in a long coat standing beside a younger figure in medical garb, their faces stern, their posture rigid. In the background, just barely visible, stood a small structure that no longer existed, something like a shed or annex. Elijah frowned, turning the photograph toward the window light, feeling a shiver despite the warmth of the room. That night, he dreamed of corridors beneath the house. In his dream, the bricked wall was gone, and he wandered through narrow passages lined with iron rings, the sound of dripping water echoing endlessly. He woke with sweat on his brow and the certainty that the house wanted to tell him something, but in a language he did not yet understand. By the end of his first week on the property, Elijah felt both exhausted and exhilarated. He had begun sketching plans for renovation, speaking with contractors about plumbing and electrical work, imagining how he could transform ruin into retreat. Yet, at the back of every conversation, every vision of a brighter future, loomed the memory of that wall, stubborn and silent. He promised himself he would leave it alone until the rest of the house was secure. But promises made in daylight often faltered at night. The transition from city life to rural isolation had been more jarring than he expected. In Chicago, even loneliness carried the hum of activity outside the window. Here, when night fell, darkness swallowed the fields entirely, and the farmhouse seemed like a lone ship adrift in an ocean of silence. Elijah found himself craving the sound of human voices, the comfort of streetlights, the press of neighbors through apartment walls. Instead, he had wind, creaking timbers, and the unyielding presence of history pressing from the basement below. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon and shadows lengthened over the fields, Elijah stood on the porch and tried to picture the families who had once lived here. Farmers rising before dawn, children running through the grass, women hanging laundry in the wind. He wondered if they had been happy, or if even then the house had whispered to them, urging silence, hiding secrets. He imagined the son of the old plowman staring at the same bricked wall, wondering why it was there, and deciding never to ask. The past was not gone. It had only been covered over, brick by brick. Elijah could feel it in his bones, a steady thrum beneath the surface, waiting. He told himself he had bought the house for peace, for escape from the endless noise of the city, but already he suspected that the house had chosen him for something else. The purchase was complete, the move accomplished, yet he had not settled. He had only stepped into the first chapter of a story that was far older than he could guess. And as the wind rattled through the eaves and the basement shifted in its stone cradle, Elijah knew that sooner or later he would have to confront what lay behind that wall. The days passed slowly in the old farmhouse, each one blurring into the next as Elijah set about the practical business of making the place livable. The house groaned with age, yet beneath its decay he could sense the stubborn endurance of its structure. He was determined to restore it, to strip away the rot and grime until it revealed the promise he had seen in the photographs. It was an act of reclamation, not only of the house, but of his own vision of a different kind of life. But with every nail pulled from the walls, with every board lifted, he found himself reminded that old houses never give themselves easily to change. They resist, clinging to the layers of history that shaped them. Elijah hired a small team of local workers to begin the first phase of renovation. Their trucks pulled into the drive one crisp morning, engines rumbling, tires crunching the gravel. He welcomed them with coffee and firm handshakes, introducing himself as the new owner, explaining his vision for the place. The men nodded politely, though he caught them exchanging glances that were not exactly encouraging. They had worked in many of the county's older homes, and perhaps they already knew that houses like this one often held more than termites and cracked beams. Still, they set to work with practiced efficiency, hauling in tools and uncoiling lengths of electrical wire that would thread through the skeleton of the house like new veins of life. From the start, the basement became the focus of their attention. Every major system, plumbing, wiring, heating, passed through its chill stone confines. The men descended with their flashlights and drills, their laughter echoing off the walls, though it faded as they moved deeper into the shadows. Elijah followed them down, trying to appear casual, but his eyes kept drifting toward the bricked wall at the far end. It seemed even more conspicuous now that the rest of the basement bustled with activity, a silent reminder of something deliberately hidden. It was one of the electricians who first pointed it out. "This section looks off," he said, running his hand across the red bricks. The others gathered, muttering in agreement. The mortar was unusually thick, hardened by time into a surface more like stone than cement. The wall did not match the rough limestone that formed the rest of the foundation. It looked newer, though still aged, as though it had been built with a specific intention, not just structural necessity. Elijah stepped forward, trying to keep his tone light. Probably just sealed off a reinforcement, right? Maybe a water issue years back. The men shrugged, but their expressions told him they were not convinced. One of them tapped the surface with the handle of a hammer. The sound was dull, muffled, the tone of something hollow beyond. That single knock stirred something in Elijah's chest, an echo of the dream he had carried since his first night in the house, the dream of corridors stretching into darkness. He folded his arms, resisting the urge to order them to break it open immediately. There would be time for that. For now, there was work to be done. Over the next few days, the house filled with the noise of renovation. Sawdust floated in the beams of sunlight. The air shook with the vibration of drills and the rhythmic pounding of hammers. Elijah supervised closely, moving from room to room, his mind always circling back to the basement. He noticed that the men avoided that corner whenever possible, focusing their efforts elsewhere. Once he overheard one of them mutter that the air was bad down there, too still, too heavy. They laughed it off, but the laughter lacked conviction. On the 5th day, as they were running conduit along the basement ceiling, the foreman approached Elijah. "Look," he said, "we can't finish this line without checking what's behind that wall. Building codes are strict. We need to verify the integrity before we seal anything up." Elijah felt his pulse quicken. Here it was, the excuse he needed, delivered by necessity rather than curiosity. He nodded, perhaps too quickly. Do what you have to do. The workers gathered around the wall, setting up portable lights that cast stark shadows across the bricks. The first swing of the sledgehammer sent a shudder through the basement, dust exploding into the air like a sigh released after decades of silence. The men coughed, covering their faces, but pressed on. Each blow rang with the sound of finality, as if the house itself resisted the intrusion. Bits of brick tumbled to the floor, fragments of mortar breaking away reluctantly. As the opening widened, a smell wafted through, a musty, organic odor, the scent of air that had been trapped for generations. It was not the sharp stench of rot, but something subtler, older, a mixture of mold, dampness, and faint metallic tang. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their movements slowing. Elijah stepped closer, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The first glimpse through the gap revealed only darkness. Then, as the dust cleared, beams of light caught on shapes within. Wooden furniture, long abandoned, hunched in the shadows. The glint of glass reflected the light in quick flashes. One of the men muttered, "Hell of a storage room." When, at last, the hole was large enough to crawl through, silence fell. The workers looked at one another, none eager to be the first to enter. Elijah, compelled by something stronger than fear, ducked his head and stepped into the breach. The air inside was thick, pressing against his skin like a damp cloth. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a room preserved as if sealed yesterday. Against one wall stood a wooden table, its surface scarred and stained with dark blotches that time had not erased. Nearby, rusted metal tools lay scattered, their forms unmistakably surgical. Scalpels, clamps, saws. Dust coated them thickly, yet their menace was undiminished. On a set of shelves stood glass jars, their contents long evaporated, but leaving behind cloudy residue that suggested they had once held something more than liquid. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. This was no storage room. This was something else entirely, something that had been meant to stay hidden. He could almost hear the whispers of the past, voices rising from the walls themselves. Behind him, one of the workers called nervously, "What do you see?" He did not answer at first. He walked slowly around the table, his flashlight sweeping across the walls. Iron rings were set into the stone, spaced evenly, as if designed to restrain. On the floor, half buried in dirt, he saw the remnants of chains, their links corroded but unmistakable. He felt the weight of it then, the realization that this space had not been built for storage or safety, but for confinement. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "It's an old room. Tools, furniture, looks like some kind of workshop." The workers did not press for details, and perhaps he was grateful for that. They seemed eager to retreat, their earlier bravado drained. By the end of the day, they had packed up their tools, muttering about taking a break until further notice. Elijah did not argue. He needed time alone, time to process what he had seen. That night, he sat in the kitchen with the lights off, staring at the darkened doorway that led to the basement. The house was silent, but he could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, that by breaking through that wall, he had disturbed a balance carefully maintained for decades. He tried to imagine who had built the wall and why. The thought that it had been erected to keep something hidden, to silence a chapter of history too dark to acknowledge, settled heavily upon him. When he finally went to bed, he dreamed again of corridors, but this time they were clearer, sharper. He saw the table, as it had been in its prime, gleaming under lamplight. He saw figures moving, men in aprons, their hands slick, their faces obscured by shadow. He heard cries, muffled and distant, echoing from unseen rooms, and through it all, he felt a presence, a will that lingered even now, bound to the stone and the soil of the farm. Elijah woke before dawn, his sheets damp with sweat, his heart pounding. The farmhouse was still, the fields outside cloaked in mist, yet he knew with absolute certainty that the wall had not been built merely to conceal space. It had been built to bury truth, and now that truth had begun to seep through the cracks. He rose, lit a lamp, and returned to the basement. Standing before the broken wall, he pressed his hand to the rough edge of the opening. The darkness beyond seemed deeper than it had before, not empty, but watchful. He whispered to himself, as though to steady his resolve, "I need to know." And though the house remained silent, he felt that it had heard him. For several days after the breach of the wall, Elijah found himself caught in a restless rhythm. The farmhouse seemed to have altered around him, its silence heavier, its shadows more insistent. He tried to maintain the routine of renovation, checking in with contractors, sketching designs for the upstairs rooms, but his thoughts always drifted downward into the basement. What he had seen there lingered in his mind with a clarity that was both vivid and unnerving. The rusted instruments, the scarred table, the iron rings embedded in stone. They were not relics of ordinary farm life, they were artifacts of something darker. Each night he told himself he would stay away, but each morning he found his steps carrying him back to the edge of the opening, his eyes straining into the gloom. The workers had not returned. Their sudden reluctance was explained with vague excuses about scheduling conflicts, but Elijah knew better. The unease that had settled over the crew was not something they would admit openly. They had seen just enough to recognize that the house contained more than dust and decay, and they wanted no part in awakening it. He couldn't blame them. Yet his own curiosity pressed harder with each passing hour. He felt that the hidden room was only the beginning, that the house was teasing him with fragments while holding back the full weight of its secret. On the third morning, after another restless night of dreams filled with flickering lamps and indistinct figures, Elijah drove into town. The courthouse sat at the center of the small community, a brick building with white columns and a clock tower that ticked steadily over streets lined with antique shops and diners. The woman at the records desk raised an eyebrow when he explained what he wanted: deeds, property transfers, any historical references to the farmhouse he had purchased. She disappeared into the stacks of bound ledgers and returned with arms full of heavy volumes. Elijah settled into a wooden chair at a long oak table, spreading the books before him. Dust rose from their covers as he turned the brittle pages, tracing the history of the land back through the decades. The earliest records described its purchase in the late 1800s by a family of considerable means. The father, a landowner of English descent, had acquired hundreds of acres during the waning years of the century. His son, noted in several entries, had trained in medicine, though the documents did not specify where. The family's name appeared again and again in local registers, always accompanied by the impression of wealth and respectability. Yet Elijah could not shake the memory of the photograph he had found in the upstairs trunk: the stern man in the long coat, the younger figure in medical garb, their stiff posture betraying nothing of warmth. As the hours passed, he pieced together fragments. Newspaper clippings from the town archives spoke of epidemics that had swept through the region in the late 19th century. Outbreaks of yellow fever and typhoid that claimed dozens of lives in neighboring communities. Among the names mentioned in connection with these outbreaks was that of the physician's son, praised for his dedication, lauded for his willingness to remain in afflicted areas when others fled. The articles described him as a man of science, brave and tireless, though always in the restrained language of period reporting. Elijah read between the lines and wondered how much of the praise had been fact, how much carefully cultivated reputation. He found hints of unease, too. A letter to the editor in one old newspaper mentioned the peculiar methods of Dr. W., without elaborating. Another noted the sudden disappearance of several immigrant laborers who had been housed near the farm, explained away as men who had moved on in the search of better opportunities. The words struck Elijah as suspiciously convenient. If these men had vanished, why were there no records of their departure, no families seeking them? He thought of the chains he had seen in the basement, the iron rings hammered into stone, and the connection formed itself unbidden in his mind. The deeper he dug, the more he sensed a pattern of silence. Whole periods of the farm's history were reduced to a few lines in county ledgers: taxes paid, acreage sold, boundaries redrawn. The details that mattered most, the lives lived within those walls, the deaths that may have occurred, were absent. History had been trimmed neatly, like the overgrown hedges he had hacked back around the farmhouse, concealing what lay beneath. Elijah leaned back in his chair, staring at the columns of faded ink. He felt an odd mixture of triumph and dread. He was closer to understanding the story of his house, yet the story itself threatened to swallow him. For the first time, he wondered whether he had been chosen for this discovery, not by fate or coincidence, but by the house itself. It had waited, patient and silent, for someone who would not look away. That afternoon, he visited the local library, a modest building with sagging shelves and the faint smell of mildew. The librarian, an elderly woman with bright eyes, listened attentively as he explained his interest in the farmhouse. She nodded knowingly, as though she had been expecting the question. That place has always had whispers around it, she said softly. People disappear from memory faster than from life, and sometimes houses hold what papers do not. She guided him to a collection of journals and memoirs written by townsfolk over the last century, the sort of private accounts that rarely made their way into official archives. Among the yellowed pages, Elijah discovered the diary of a schoolteacher who had lived in the county during the 1880s. The entries were filled with mundane details about lessons, weather, and church services, but one passage caught his attention. It described the teacher's unease at passing the farmhouse late in the evening. He wrote of hearing strange cries like the voices of the sick carried on the wind, and of seeing lantern light flickering through basement windows even when the rest of the house lay dark. He mentioned rumors that the doctor who lived there had been treating patients during the fever outbreak, though none ever seemed to recover. "They go in, but they do not come out," the teacher wrote. "I pray for their souls." Elijah closed the journal and sat in silence, the words echoing in his mind. They aligned too perfectly with what he had seen beneath his own house: the instruments, the table, the chains. The realization was like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples outward. This was not imagination, not paranoia. The house had been used for something unspeakable, and the community had chosen to look away. As dusk settled over the town, Elijah gathered his notes and returned to the farmhouse. The drive seemed longer than usual, the fields stretching into darkness, the road narrowing until it felt like a path into another world. When he parked in front of the house, the silhouette of its roofline loomed against a pale moon. He carried the weight of the archives with him as he unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was cool and heavy, as though the house knew he had uncovered another layer of its story. He walked slowly to the basement door, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Pausing at the threshold, he considered what he had learned. The epidemics, the vanished laborers, the doctor praised in print but whispered about in private. The pieces formed a pattern, and that pattern pointed toward the room behind the bricked wall. It was not an accident, not a curiosity. It was the heart of the house, the secret around which everything else had been built. Elijah descended into the basement, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He stood before the opening once more, staring into the room where rusted tools glimmered faintly and shadows clung to every surface. He thought of the diary's line, "They go in, but they do not come out." He whispered the words aloud, his voice trembling in the silence. For the first time, he felt not only fear, but responsibility. The archives had given him a glimpse of truth, but it was incomplete. The house demanded more of him. It demanded that he uncover what had been buried, that he finish the work others had begun but abandoned. He did not know yet if he was strong enough to face what waited in the deeper shadows, but he knew there was no turning back. The past had reached out from dusty pages and silent rooms, and now it had him firmly in its grasp. The weight of what Elijah had uncovered in the archives clung to him like damp clothes as he returned each evening to the farmhouse. The silence of the place no longer felt neutral. It was thick with implication, as if the very timbers remembered what had once happened under this roof. He could not shake the image of the schoolteacher's diary entry, the whispered testimony that patients went into the basement but never came out. Every time he glanced at the broken wall, he thought of those words, as though the stones themselves were complicit in the concealment, and the concealment had been deliberate. Someone had not simply abandoned that room, but had sealed it away, bricked it up with the determination of a man who wanted the past to be erased. But the past did not erase itself. It only waits. In the days following his research trip, Elijah's curiosity curdled into obsession. The room beyond the wall, partially explored in that first breach, seemed to pull at him like a magnet. He spent hours in the basement, studying its dimensions, brushing his hand along the rough edges of the opening, inhaling the strange mix of stale air and mildew. Each time, he lingered longer, allowing his flashlight beam to wander farther across the surfaces inside. He began to catalog the objects he had seen: the scarred table, the iron rings, the surgical instruments. Yet he knew instinctively that there was more, that he had only glimpsed the threshold of what lay hidden. One morning, unable to resist, he set up lanterns and carried in tools. The workers had abandoned the project. He had no one but himself to continue. The house creaked faintly, as though disapproving of his solitude, but Elijah pressed on. He widened the breach in the wall until he could step inside without crouching, his boots crunching on layers of dust that had settled over generations. The air inside was cooler, as if untouched by the world above for more than a century. The chamber was larger than he had realized. Shadows retreated reluctantly as the lantern light spread, revealing details with merciless clarity. The table in the center bore deep grooves where blades had bitten into wood again and again. The stains upon its surface had darkened into near permanence, a mottled map of suffering. Against the walls, shelves sagged under the weight of glass vessels. Most were empty now, but some held residues clinging stubbornly to their interiors, flakes of dark sediment, cloudy streaks that suggested chemical reactions long past. When Elijah uncorked one bottle out of foolish impulse, the stench that escaped was sharp and bitter, forcing him to stagger back with watering eyes. On the far wall, he noticed markings etched into the stone. At first, he thought they were measurements, perhaps calculations of some kind, but as he traced them with his fingers, he realized they were something else entirely. Strange symbols, some resembling alchemical signs he had seen in old texts, others more like fragments of prayers. The juxtaposition was chilling. Science and faith twisted together, as though the doctor who had worked here believed that medicine and ritual could merge into a single terrible practice. Venturing deeper, Elijah found two narrow doorways branching off from the main chamber. He ducked through the first and entered a smaller room barely wide enough for a pair of beds. The iron frames still stood, rusted but unmistakable, with remnants of straw mattresses collapsed into heaps of rot. The rings in the walls here were more numerous, some still attached to short lengths of chain. His flashlight caught faint scratches carved into the stone, words and names half erased by time. He leaned closer, heart pounding, and made out a single plea scratched in shaky letters: "God forgive me." He backed away quickly, nearly stumbling over the uneven floor. The sense of human presence was overwhelming, as though the very walls were saturated with memory. He forced himself onward into the second side room. This one contained only crates, their wood rotted, their lids broken. Inside he saw fragments of cloth, bones that crumbled at his touch, and rusted instruments too crude to belong in any physician's kit. They looked more like tools of restraint, implements designed not to heal but to hold down a body against its will. Elijah staggered back into the main chamber, his breath ragged. The lanterns flickered, shadows leaping across the walls. For the first time he understood that the room was not merely a relic of medical history gone astray. It was a laboratory of death, a place where human beings had been reduced to specimens, their suffering converted into data, their bodies into material. He could almost hear them still, the echo of cries buried beneath layers of dust and stone. And yet, mingled with his horror was fascination. He moved toward the shelves again, lifting one of the glass jars, tilting it toward the light. A thin ring of residue clung to the inside, shimmering faintly like oil. He wondered what it had once contained: tissue, organ fragments, or some chemical solution used to preserve the dead. He thought of the medical schools in the late 19th century, hungry for cadavers, eager for specimens. Could it be that the doctor had supplied them, selling the remains of those who never emerged from this basement? The thought made his stomach twist, yet it seemed terribly plausible. On the desk in the corner, he found a stack of papers fused together by moisture, the ink blurred but still legible in places. He separated the pages carefully, revealing a script that was meticulous and cold. The handwriting belonged to a man who believed in order, who catalogued suffering as though it were merely another experiment. Phrases leapt out. Patient failed to respond to depletion cycle, administered further purge with mercury compound, specimen prepared for shipment. Each line was like a blow, confirming what Elijah had already suspected. These were not patients treated with compassion. They were subjects sacrificed in pursuit of some grim conviction. He read until the words swam before his eyes, then slammed the papers back onto the desk. The lantern light seemed dimmer, the air colder. He realized that he had been holding his breath, as though afraid to inhale the same atmosphere that once filled the lungs of the condemned. Straightening, he forced himself to step back, to take in the room as a whole. The table, the tools, the symbols, the chains, all of it formed a single picture, undeniable and damning. As he ascended the basement stairs that night, his legs trembled. He left the lanterns burning behind him, unable to bear extinguishing them, afraid of what darkness might reclaim when the light was gone. Upstairs, he collapsed into a chair, his hands shaking. He had seen enough to confirm every whisper, every rumor he had unearthed in the archives. The farmhouse was not simply old. It was haunted, not by spirits alone, but by the weight of deliberate cruelty. Sleep was impossible. When he closed his eyes, he saw the names scratched into the walls, the grooves in the wood, the neat, merciless script of the journals. He heard chains clinking softly, though the house was still. He rose and paced the halls until dawn, when the gray light revealed the fields outside, silent and indifferent. In the days that followed, Elijah returned to the chamber again and again. Each visit revealed some new detail, some new horror. A scrap of fabric caught between stones, stained dark. A child's shoe half buried in the dirt. A cluster of bottles labeled in Latin, their glass fogged by age. The more he found, the more the pattern sharpened, until there could be no doubt. This had been a place of systematic murder disguised as healing, an enterprise cloaked in the language of science but fueled by greed and obsession. And yet, beneath the revulsion, Elijah felt a growing resolve. If the past had been sealed away in silence, he would not allow it to remain hidden. The voices etched into the stone had called to him, and he could not turn away. The farmhouse had revealed its laboratory of death, but Elijah knew there were deeper layers still. The house had given him a glimpse, but not the whole truth. And until he understood everything, he would not be free of its grasp. That night, as the wind rattled the windows and the fields whispered under the moon, Elijah sat with the papers spread before him, the symbols burned into his mind. He whispered to himself that he would not let their suffering vanish into silence again. The house had chosen him, and he would see it through. The days after Elijah's first true exploration of the basement stretched into a blur of sleepless nights and uneasy mornings. He had seen enough to know that the house concealed horrors more profound than he could have imagined when he signed those papers weeks earlier. Yet, even with the confirmation of his worst suspicions, he could not keep away from the chamber. It had taken hold of him, wrapped its cold hand around his thoughts, and each evening he found himself descending the stairs again, lantern in hand, as though pulled by invisible strings. He told himself it was research, an effort to preserve history, to honor forgotten voices. But there was more to it than that. Something in the silence of those stone rooms beckoned to him, demanded his presence, as though the dead had been waiting all this time for someone who would not turn away. What unnerved him most was the change in the atmosphere of the house itself. Before, the creaks and groans of the old structure had seemed like quirks of age, random noises of wood and wind. Now they carried an uncanny rhythm, like footsteps in the distance, like whispers brushing just beyond the edge of hearing. The farmhouse was not simply old, it was aware. At night, when Elijah lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, he often felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down from the dark corners of the room. When sleep did come, it was filled with fevered dreams, shadowed figures moving through the basement, flickering lamps casting grotesque shapes across the walls, and always the table at the center, waiting, as though eager to be used again. One evening, as dusk spread its violet haze across the fields, Elijah sat at the kitchen table with the recovered papers spread before him. He had been reading them obsessively, trying to extract meaning from the disjointed phrases that survived water stains and decay. They described procedures with cold precision, cataloged failures as if they were mere inconveniences. But what caught his eye now were the names. Not of patients, for those were rarely written, but of substances and rituals, mercury, calomel, depletion cycles, purgatives, terms he expected from a 19th century physician. Yet, interspersed among them were fragments of prayer and symbols that belonged less to science than to something older, darker. He found himself tracing those strange markings again and again, until the lines blurred and his eyes burned with fatigue. That night, he dreamed not of the doctor, but of those who had suffered. He saw them faintly at first, lying on the beds with chains at their wrists, eyes wide with terror. Their lips moved, whispering words he could not hear. As the dream deepened, the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chorus of despair. He woke with his chest tight, heart hammering as though he had been running. The sound lingered in his ears even after he sat up in bed. He told himself it was memory, the residue of nightmare. But when he rose and walked through the house, he heard it again, faint and real this time, drifting upward from the floorboards, the sound of moaning, soft and fragmented, like voices trapped in stone. The following morning, Elijah sought solace in town. He visited the diner, ordered coffee, and tried to lose himself in the mundane chatter of locals discussing weather and crops. But their eyes followed him. They knew who he was now, the outsider who had purchased the haunted farmhouse. Conversations dimmed when he entered. A woman leaned to her companion and muttered something, not quietly enough, about digging where you shouldn't dig. He forced a polite smile, but the sense of being watched followed him back to his car. That afternoon, he stopped at the library again, hoping to find something that would explain the symbols he had seen etched into the basement walls. The librarian, Mrs. Whitaker, raised her brows when she saw him carrying in his notes. She pulled down several volumes on esoteric medical practices of the 19th century, tomes whose pages were yellow and brittle, their margins filled with the annotations of long-dead scholars. As Elijah flipped through them, he discovered unsettling parallels. Physicians who believed illness could be purged by pain, who combined medical theories with religious fervor, convinced that salvation and science could be forced into one bloody ritual. It chilled him to think that the doctor of his farmhouse might have stood among them, blending superstition with cruelty, until healing itself became indistinguishable from torment. Later that week, Elijah visited an elderly man who had been recommended to him by a clerk at the courthouse. The man, Mr. Cunningham, was nearly 90 and lived in a sagging house at the edge of town, surrounded by fields gone wild. His mind was sharp, though his body seemed fragile, and when Elijah asked about the farmhouse, the old man grew quiet. At length, he admitted that his grandfather had spoken of it. "Said it was a place of suffering," the old man murmured. "Said he'd seen lights in the windows when there shouldn't have been any. He swore that the cries of the dying were carried on the night air." Elijah pressed him gently for more, but Cunningham shook his head. "Some things folks here prefer to forget. We bury our past deep, son, but the earth never really keeps it down." The words haunted Elijah as he drove home. He arrived at twilight, the farmhouse looming in silhouette against a bruised sky. The moment he stepped inside, he felt the difference. The air was heavy, charged. The faint moaning he had heard before returned, drifting upward like a draft through unseen cracks. This time it was louder, unmistakable, as if the voices were gathering strength from his attention. He followed the sound to the basement door, his lantern in hand, and descended. The chamber greeted him with its usual chill, but the silence was broken now. The moans seemed to seep from the walls themselves, from the iron rings and the chains, from the etched prayers that still marked the stone. He whispered aloud, his voice trembling, "What do you want from me?" The moan swelled, overlapping into words he almost understood, then fell silent again, leaving only the echo of his own voice. That night, he dreamed not only of the suffering, but of the doctor himself. He saw the man clearly now, tall, gaunt, eyes burning with cold conviction. He watched him stand over the table, his apron stained, his hand steady as he cut and bled and recorded. The doctor's lips moved, reciting phrases in Latin, a prayer twisted into command. Elijah woke gasping, the image seared into his mind. He knew then that the voices were not mere memory. They were reaching for him, demanding to be heard, and through them the doctor's presence returned as well, bound eternally to the chamber he had created. The next day, Elijah walked the fields behind the house, searching for answers in the soil itself. He remembered the old man's words about the earth not keeping secrets, and he began to notice depressions in the ground, irregular and out of place. They were not marked graves, but the shape and spacing were suggestive. He imagined bodies hastily buried, covered over to conceal the evidence. Standing among the weeds, he felt surrounded by an invisible congregation, dozens of souls whose final rest had been stolen from them. The moaning in the basement was not confined there. It resonated through the land itself. When he returned inside, he sat for hours in the parlor, staring at the fireless hearth. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He could not be like the townsfolk who chose silence, who looked away to preserve their own comfort. The voices were demanding something more. They wanted recognition, justice, perhaps even release. Yet the thought of pursuing the truth further filled him with dread. Each discovery dragged him deeper, bound him tighter to the farmhouse, until he no longer knew if he was uncovering the past or being consumed by it. That night, as he drifted toward sleep, the voices returned again, clearer than ever. He heard them whisper his name. He sat up sharply in bed, his skin clammy, the room thick with silence once more. He whispered back into the dark, "I hear you." And for the first time he felt an answering calm, as though the house itself had acknowledged him. But peace did not follow. It was only the beginning of something heavier, something that would soon demand more than listening. The voices of the past had found him, and they would not let him go. The voices did not stop after that night. Once Elijah admitted that he could hear them, they returned with greater persistence, a chorus that slipped into his waking hours as easily as they invaded his sleep. He would be working in the kitchen, papers scattered before him, and suddenly the faint rhythm of chains rattling would echo from the floorboards. He would be walking the fields and hear whispers rising with the wind, indistinct but insistent, urging him back toward the house, back towards the truth. It became impossible to deny that he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The farmhouse had revealed itself, and now it demanded more of him. At first, he thought the path forward was obvious. He would tell someone. He would share his discoveries with the wider world, show them the instruments, the journals, the carvings on the walls. The weight of history could not remain hidden in one man's basement. He began by contacting a history department at a nearby university, drafting an email in which he described the sealed chamber, the medical instruments, the records. He attached several photographs he had taken, images that even in low resolution conveyed their unsettling nature. The iron rings, the scarred table, the symbols etched into stone. For a day he waited with nervous anticipation, convinced that someone would reply quickly, eager to investigate. But the silence that followed was almost deliberate. His message went unanswered. He called the department directly, only to be shuffled from one administrator to another until the line went dead. When he tried again, the call went to voicemail. Days passed without acknowledgement. At first, Elijah assumed it was bureaucracy, the sluggishness of institutions, but then he noticed other things. His internet connection, usually reliable, began cutting out whenever he tried to upload more files. A man at the diner, one he had never spoken to before, muttered under his breath as Elijah passed, "Leave well enough alone." Another afternoon he returned to find muddy tire tracks leading up to the farmhouse, though no one claimed to have visited. The resistance was not only silent, it was active. Someone knew what he had uncovered and wanted him to stop. When the first journalist he contacted canceled their planned call without explanation, Elijah realized the scale of what he was up against. The story was bigger than he had imagined, tangled in threads that reached beyond the doctor who had worked in his basement. The doctor had not acted alone. He had been supported, shielded, perhaps even funded by families who still lived in the county, families whose wealth and status stretched from the 19th century into the present. To expose him would be to expose them as well. The townspeople confirmed his suspicions in subtle ways. At the post office, the clerk, who had once been friendly, now avoided his eyes. The grocer, who had welcomed him at first, refused to speak beyond the barest necessities. In the diner, conversations fell silent the moment he walked in, only to resume in hushed tones after he left. They all knew, or at least they knew enough to fear. Their silence was a wall just as impenetrable as the bricks he had broken through in his basement. Elijah's frustration grew. He could not abandon the truth, not after hearing the voices, not after reading the names scratched into stone. Yet the more he pushed, the more isolated he became. Workers refused to return to the house, citing vague excuses about scheduling or illness. Neighbors who had once waved from their porches now turned their backs. Even in town, he felt the weight of eyes on him, measuring, warning. He had uncovered something the community had spent generations burying, and they would not forgive him for dragging it into the light. One evening, after another fruitless attempt to reach a reporter, Elijah sat in the parlor staring at the darkened fireplace. His hands trembled as he poured himself a glass of water. He could no longer tell whether the pressure he felt came from within the house or from outside forces determined to silence him. The result was the same: an atmosphere of suffocating tension, a sense that he was under siege. He had wanted peace, had imagined himself restoring a farmhouse into a sanctuary. Instead, he had inherited a battlefield, one where history itself was the enemy. It was during one of his walks into town that the threat became explicit. As he left the library at dusk, a man stepped out from the shadows near the steps. Elijah recognized him as one of the men who had once worked briefly on the renovation crew. The man's expression was grim, his voice low. "Best you stop asking questions," he said. "Some things around here don't want to be found." When Elijah demanded to know who had sent him, the man shook his head. "Doesn't matter who. Just listen. Keep digging, and you won't like what happens next." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Elijah alone with his pulse hammering in his ears. That night, the farmhouse felt more oppressive than ever. Every creak of the floorboards seemed like a footstep, every whisper of wind like a voice at the window. He sat awake until dawn, the lantern burning beside him, and made his choice. He would not stop. Whatever forces resisted him, they were doing so because the truth mattered. The voices in the basement had sought him out, and he would not betray them by returning to silence. Still, resolve did not shield him from fear. The following day, as he sorted through the scattered papers in the basement, he discovered a fresh detail that tightened the knot in his chest. In the doctor's records, scrawled in his precise hand, were references not only to experiments, but to transactions. Phrases like specimens shipped and payment received stood out in stark clarity. Elijah realized that the conspiracy he faced was not just local. The doctor had been part of a network, one that fed bodies and organs to institutions hungry for them. If the families of the county had covered for him, it was because they too had profited, their fortunes tied to the suffering of the nameless dead. The discovery clarified the hostility he now faced. It was not superstition or simple fear of scandal. It was legacy. The wealth of certain households, the prestige of certain names, had been built on the foundation of crimes committed in his basement. To expose the doctor was to expose them. Their resistance was not only to protect the past, it was to protect the present. When Elijah returned to town with this knowledge weighing on him, the atmosphere was unmistakably different. Conversations halted more sharply. Eyes followed him more openly. One woman muttered a prayer under her breath as he passed, as though warding off contagion. He began to wonder if he was being followed. Cars seemed to appear behind him on lonely roads, headlights lingering too long in his rearview mirror before vanishing. At night, he thought he heard footsteps in the yard, the crunch of gravel beneath tires. The pressure mounted until he felt trapped between two forces, the voices of the dead demanding truth and the living determined to silence it. Both pressed upon him with equal intensity, pulling him in opposite directions. His nights became battlegrounds of conscience, his dreams filled with visions of the doctor and his victims, their faces overlapping until he could no longer separate them. He woke, drenched in sweat, his hands shaking, whispering aloud to steady himself. But with the fear came clarity. He understood now that silence was complicity. To do nothing was to join the chain of those who had buried the truth, who had chosen reputation over justice. He would not be one of them. He had been brought here, drawn into this place, to finish what others had abandoned, even if it cost him his standing in the community, even if it threatened his safety. He could not retreat. As autumn deepened and the fields around the farmhouse turned to brittle gold, Elijah sat at his desk and began drafting a detailed account of his findings. He described the chamber, the instruments, the records, the voices that refused to rest. He wrote not for the local authorities, not for the newspapers that would turn him away, but for history itself. If they would not listen now, perhaps one day someone would. He owed the dead that much. Yet even as his pen moved, the farmhouse seemed to shift around him, its timbers groaning, its shadows lengthening. The conspiracy he faced was not abstract. It was close, pressing, alive in the very walls. And he knew that before he could complete his task, before he could reveal everything, he would have to confront not only the living but the last secrets of the house itself. Somewhere beneath the stone and soil, beyond the chamber he had already uncovered, there remained another barrier, another silence waiting to be broken. And breaking it might demand more of him than he was prepared to give. Elijah knew he had reached a point where hesitation was no longer possible. The discoveries in the basement, the fragments of journals, the whispers that seemed to cling to every stone of the foundation, had brought him to the threshold of a final decision. He had spent nights pacing the farmhouse, his lantern casting nervous shadows across the walls, weighing the danger of pressing further against the greater danger of leaving the truth buried. The pressure from the town had grown unbearable, the silent hostility of neighbors, the murmurs in the diner, the veiled threat delivered by the former worker. It was clear that the living were just as invested in keeping the silence as the dead were in breaking it. And between them, he stood alone, the only one who could choose whether the wall of secrecy would remain intact or be broken forever. The farmhouse felt different now, alive in ways that made his skin crawl. Each creak of the staircase seemed calculated. Each flicker of the lantern revealed shadows that retreated too quickly, as though watching from the edges of the light. When Elijah tried to sleep, he was pulled into dreams of burial grounds, his feet sinking into soft soil where nameless bodies lay hidden. The voices had grown clearer, no longer mere moans but distinct phrases, their tones urgent, imploring. They called his name, pleaded for recognition, whispered that only he could finish what had been begun. The voices were insistent now, and the weight of them pressed upon him until he could hardly breathe. One morning, after a night of relentless dreams, Elijah rose with a calmness that startled him. He no longer felt torn by indecision. His course was set. He dressed simply, gathered tools, and descended into the basement. The chamber greeted him with its familiar chill, the lantern light gleaming off rusted metal and glass. Yet he did not linger on the instruments or the table. His eyes were fixed on the far wall, the stretch of stone that seemed too uniform, too deliberate to be part of the original foundation. He had noticed it before, but had resisted the urge to break it down. Now he knew what it was. It was the last barrier, the final concealment. He set to work with the hammer and chisel, each strike reverberating through the basement like a drumbeat. The mortar crumbled reluctantly, releasing clouds of dust that clung to his skin and hair. He worked with grim determination, ignoring the ache in his arms, the sweat stinging his eyes. As the wall yielded inch by inch, the air behind it began to seep through, a stagnant breath that smelled of earth and something older, something metallic. The voices rose with it, a swelling chorus that urged him on. His heart pounded, but he did not stop. He could not stop. When, at last, the opening was wide enough, Elijah pressed his lantern through and peered inside. What he saw stole his breath. The room beyond was larger than the others, a hidden chamber that stretched deep into the earth. Along the walls were stacked wooden boxes, their lids nailed shut but warped with age. The lantern light revealed their contents through cracks and gaps. Bones, dozens of them piled within like firewood. Some boxes had split entirely, spilling their grim cargo across the dirt floor. Skulls grinned up at him from the shadows, empty sockets staring with mute accusation. The chamber was a crypt, a warehouse of the forgotten dead. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on fragments of bone. The silence here was oppressive, but it did not last. As the lantern light spread, the voices returned, no longer faint but overwhelming, a cacophony of grief and rage that filled his ears and made his vision swim. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head, whispering apologies to the nameless souls who surrounded him. The air was so heavy it felt alive, pressing against his skin, seeping into his lungs. He staggered to his feet, forcing himself to look beyond the boxes, and found a desk against the far wall. Upon it lay another journal, larger than the fragments he had discovered before, its leather cover cracked but intact. With trembling hands, Elijah opened it. The pages were filled with the doctor's precise handwriting, every line a record of the atrocities committed in this place. Here were the names of the experiments, the methods, the outcomes. Here was the confession he had not dared to make in life, preserved with a clinical detachment. The doctor wrote of his belief that suffering could forge immunity, that by breaking the body he could purify it. He wrote of the shipments of organs, the payments received, the complicity of families who supplied him with subjects and profited from his trade. And at the end, in a series of fevered entries, he wrote of his conviction that his work would never die, that the voices of his specimens would ensure his legacy endured. Elijah read until his vision blurred, then slammed the book shut. His stomach churned, his hands shook violently. He understood now that the farmhouse was not simply a site of medical cruelty. It was a machine of death, sustained by greed, shielded by community silence, and preserved by deliberate deceit. The journal was proof, undeniable and damning, a document that could strip away generations of lies. But proof alone was not enough. He knew the living would resist, would threaten, would bury him if they had to. The decision before him was monumental, to risk everything by exposing the truth or to join the line of men and women who had kept silent. He stumbled out of the chamber, carrying the journal against his chest, and collapsed on the basement stairs. For a long time he sat there in the dim light, listening to the chorus of voices. They had quieted now, as though waiting for his choice. He whispered into the silence, "I'll tell it. I'll tell everything." A hush fell over the chamber, and for the first time Elijah felt something like peace. In the days that followed, he began to compile his notes into a coherent narrative. He described every object, every inscription, every scrap of evidence. He photographed the boxes of bones, the chains, the journals. He wrote of the doctor's crimes, of the conspiracy that had shielded him, of the families who had profited. He sent copies to journalists beyond the county, to universities out of state, to organizations dedicated to preserving historical truth. He knew that local resistance would be fierce, that attempts would be made to silence him, but he was no longer afraid. The dead had found their voice in him, and he would not betray them. Yet even as he wrote, he understood that his battle was only beginning. The community would fight to protect its reputation, just as it had in the 19th century. The families implicated would deny everything, would call him a liar, an outsider, a man inventing horrors for attention. But Elijah had the journal, and he had the bones. He had the voices that whispered still, reminding him that silence was complicity. On the final night of autumn, as the wind howled through the fields and the farmhouse shuddered with its weight, Elijah stood on the porch with the journal in his hands. The land around him was quiet, the sky thick with stars. He thought of the generations who had lived here, who had turned away from the truth to preserve their own safety. He thought of the nameless souls buried in boxes, hidden behind walls, their cries stifled for more than a century. And he thought of his own choice, the one he had made to break the silence. The farmhouse loomed behind him, its windows dark, its secrets no longer sealed. He felt the presence of the voices at his back, not haunting now, but watching, waiting. He raised the journal toward the night sky and whispered, "You are not forgotten." For a moment the wind stilled, the fields fell utterly silent, and he knew that they had heard him. The final wall had been broken, the truth was free. And though the living might resist, though the community might fight to bury it again, Elijah understood that the dead would never allow it to remain hidden. Their voices would echo through him, through the words he had written, until the world listened. If this story gave you chills, don't stop here. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next dark mystery waiting to be uncovered. Click on one of these videos on your screen to keep the nightmare going and dive even deeper into America's forgotten secrets. And share this video with a friend who thinks old houses are safe. You'll prove them wrong.